Britain, spring 1940. The city of Birmingham lives under the hum of war. Outside, the sky is grey and heavy with smoke. In the courtyards, women in headscarves sweep up shards of glass after the night's air raids. On rooftops, boys stand watch with buckets of sand. They're called fire sentinels. Every siren sounds like a verdict. But deep beneath the university dome, among dust, copper, and the scent of ozone, something entirely different is unfolding. A quiet revolution that no one will know about for months. There, in the physics department's basement lab at the University of Birmingham, Professor John Randall and his assistant Harry Boot work in semi-darkness. The room resembles a forge more than a scientific hall. Coils, glass tubes, wires, flickering lamps everywhere. A sheet of paper covered in circuit sketches, equations, and greasy fingerprints hangs on the wall. In the corner, an old oscilloscope trembles with tension. The air carries a faint metallic taste, the taste of invention. Randall and Boot are tackling a problem on which Britain's survival may depend. German Junkers and Heinkels bomb London and the ports, while the early warning system, the chain home network, operates on long waves and sees far, but crudely. It cannot detect altitude, nor spot submarines or torpedo boats. A breakthrough is needed. A new eye for war, capable of seeing everything hidden in night and fog. That night, Randall is frustrated. He rubs his forehead, leaving a copper smear on his skin. On the table lies a heavy cylinder, a magnetron, a strange device where electrons whirl like bees in a hive. They're trying to make it emit waves just a few centimeters long, an incredible challenge for the time. "Still zero," mutters Boot, watching the instrument's needle. "No power, no frequency." "Raise the current a bit, Harry. 10, 15 kilovolts." "It'll blow." "Let it blow. Better an explosion than silence." Boot hesitates, then flips the switch. The air hums like a taut string. A dry crackle bursts from the magnetron, and the oscilloscope suddenly comes alive. A pulse flashes on the screen, short, sharp, as if space itself had coughed. The needle jumps off the scale. "What was that?" Randall steps back. "Probably a fault. Cathode overload." But the pulse repeats. Again and again, each time stronger. The room fills with a hum, like the low singing of a transformer. Metal vibrates, the air warms. Dust falls from the ceiling. Boot grabs a wrench and cuts the power. Silence. Only raindrops tapping the window. They exchange glances. "What did we just do?" "Broke the device," Boot guesses. "Or built a new one," Randall replies. He walks to the oscilloscope, flips a switch, and writes numbers in the logbook. Wavelength, 10 centimeters. No one has ever reached that range before. Centimeter waves. This is no longer just radar. It's the ability to see what was once invisible. Outside, a siren wails. Somewhere in the distance, engines roar. Another raid. But in the university's basement, where the lamps flicker, the birth of a new era goes unnoticed. Randall turns off the lights to save power. In the darkness, the magnetron glows faintly from within, as if breathing. "We have to repeat this," he says quietly. "And if it's not a fault, then we've just found a weapon that doesn't kill, but saves." The next day, a note appears in the lab journal, the ink blurred by steam. "Unexpected pulse. Likely error in anode cavity configuration. Investigate." Neither of them knows yet that this error will change the course of the war, that their magnetron will soon cross the Atlantic, land in the hands of American engineers at MIT, and become the heart of new radars. Radars that will spot submarines in the night and save thousands of lives in the cold waters of the Atlantic. But for now, just 2 men and a strange hum beneath Birmingham's dome. And somewhere in that hum, the whisper of the future is already audible. The morning after that strange experiment, Randall and Boots' lab looked like a battlefield struck by miniature lightning. Scorched wires lay scattered across the floor. Fragments of mica insulation crunched underfoot, and a dark stain marked the wall, the imprint of a morning breakthrough. The air still hung heavy with ozone and smoke. Yet, against all odds, the magnetron sat intact on the table. Blackened, cracked at the edge, but alive. Boot was the first to dare switch on the lamp. "Yesterday's pulse," he began, peering into the notes. "If I'm reading this right, couldn't have come from a standard discharge." Randall silently traced his finger across the equations, leaving smudges of graphite on the paper. "Yes, the resonator cavities overheated, but the oscillations were stable. Harry, do you know what that means?" "That we did everything wrong," Boots smirked. "Yes, and that's our luck." The error they feared yesterday turned out to be a breakthrough. A flawed solder joint had left one anode partially disconnected, forming a new configuration of resonant fields. Inside the magnetron, electrons didn't collide chaotically. They began to move in sync, as if guided by an invisible rhythm. Thus emerged the cavern structure, paving the way for powerful microwave emitters. Randall wrote in the log, "Anomalous operating mode. Possible microwave generation at reduced anode current." He didn't know that this paragraph would enter the annals of radar history. Later, in March 1940, they invited representatives of the British Admiralty to the lab. The sirs and captains entered cautiously, tired of hearing mad physicists promise invisible vision or eyes from the ether. One officer, gray-haired and dry, muttered, "We don't need vision. We need a way to keep our convoys alive." Randall nodded and powered up the device. A clean, steady line flashed across the oscilloscope. A lieutenant raised his eyebrows. "What is that?" "Your ship," Boot replied, "but it's 40 kilometers offshore. And yet we see it." Silence fell. Someone exhaled through clenched teeth. Another, with a flicker of cautious hope, whispered, "How many of these devices do you have?" "1," Randall answered honestly. "Then make 1,000. Thus began the story of the British magnetron number 12, the most powerful microwave tube of its time. A soldering error, a misaligned plate, an overcooled coil. All of it birthed a technology capable of casting an invisible net across the ocean. A week later, Randall and Boot received orders. Transfer development to the Ministry of Aviation. Project classified. Category: most confidential. Their lab was sealed. Both scientists received new credentials. A sign appeared on the door. "Do not enter. Experimental atmospheric pressure measurements." In truth, pressure was no longer being measured. Now they were listening to the air. Their work caught the attention of a group already researching compact radar for aircraft. Thus emerged what would later be called the Birmingham Test Bed, the first prototype of an airborne microwave radar. In June 1940, magnetron number 12 was installed on a Wellington, an old twin-engine bomber. Night, the air thick with humidity. Captain Hudson, ordered to perform a blind flight, nervously fiddled with his harness. On the instrument panel, a strange screen had been added, a green arc with flickering marks. "So this is your new compass, Professor?" he joked, glancing back at Randall. "This is your new eye," Randall replied. The plane climbed. 20 minutes later, the screen came alive. A bright dot appeared. "What's that?" Hudson leaned closer. "The coast of France," Randall said quietly. Hudson laughed, not with joy, but in astonishment. "We're flying through clouds. I can't see a thing." "But it can." The radar saw through night, through rain, through fog. And somewhere below, beneath that same darkness, German submarines had no idea that their future nightmare had just taken flight. Weeks later, the technology would reach American hands, along with the magnetron, secretly transported across the Atlantic as part of the Tizard mission. At MIT's radiation laboratory, engineers would refine the device, produce serial models, and deploy a global network of microwave radars. And in the Birmingham Lab's journal, one final pencil note would remain: "Error confirmed. Cannot be repeated, but must be." An error that was never meant to happen became salvation. And ever since, thousands of pilots, ships, and convoys owe their lives to that very crack in a copper plate, the one Boot once tried to fix. Autumn 1940. London is burning. Night raids by the Luftwaffe are turning entire districts into ruins. Stones breathe ash, and the sky roars like a blacksmith's bellows. In the underground tunnels of the Tube, where people now live, conversations aren't about bread, but about time. How much longer can Britain hold out alone? Amid this chaos, a small circle gathers in the Admiralty Hall. Among them stands a slender, silver-haired man with bright eyes and a slightly weary face, Sir Henry Tizard, scientist, strategist, and, as history will later call him, the last diplomat of science. He's not a general, not a spy, not a politician, yet he's been entrusted with the impossible, to deliver all of Britain's military secrets to America. Secrets, not metaphorically. In a dark walnut case, steel reinforced and sealed with 5 wax stamps, lies everything that could change the course of the war. Radar schematics, blueprints of Frank Whittle's jet engine, data on a new anti-aircraft system, and the heart of the mission, magnetron number 12. Churchill's cabinet is divided. "This is treasure," shouts the Minister of Supply. "What if the Americans deceive us? Take it and leave us empty-handed?" Tizard replies calmly, almost in a whisper, "If we perish, the treasure will be worthless to anyone." On August 10th, 1940, the steamship SS Duchess of Richmond departs Liverpool. In its hold, hidden among crates labeled scientific equipment, is the very suitcase. Official documents listed as Field Measurement Kit number 4. Only 4 people aboard know the truth. Tizard stands on deck, hat in hand. The Atlantic wind tears a newspaper from his fingers, as if history itself is trying to escape the grasp of its author. The journey across the ocean is a passage between worlds. On one side, old Europe, dying beneath the thunder of guns. On the other, America, not yet at war, but already pulsing with immense industrial might. Tizard gazes at the horizon and thinks, if they believe us, the war will change. If not, it's the end. A week later, the mission arrives in Washington. The delegation is received politely, but cautiously. Americans are used to allies asking for help, not offering gifts. When Tizard opens the steel case, the faces of U.S. Air Force generals shift from curiosity to skepticism, and then to quiet astonishment. They lay the magnetron on the table, a copper cylinder, like a strange piece of mechanical heart. One American officer asks, "What is this? A vacuum tube?" Tizard smiles. "No, This is the end of invisibility. The next day, the device is sent to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. There, in Building 20, Professors Alfred Loomis and Lee DeForest conduct the first tests. Their lab hums like a hive. Electrons dance between anodes, and a signal appears on the screen, stronger and clearer than anything they've ever seen. Loomis utters his famous line, "Gentlemen, this is not just a device. This is our new eye on the world." Thus is born the MIT Radiation Laboratory, Rad Lab, as insiders will call it. Within mere months, they will develop dozens of radar variants, naval, airborne, ground-based, even portable, small enough to fit in a backpack. Thousands of engineers, physicists, and students unite to transform Britain's soldering mistake into one of the most powerful detection systems in human history. And Tizard returns home empty-handed, but with a faint smile. At a meeting with Churchill, he says, "We lost a secret, but gained the future." A year later, magnetron radar will be installed on every British bomber. Pilots flying through the black skies over Europe will no longer be blind. The Allies have learned to see through the night, and it all began with an old professor and a suitcase who dared to trade a secret for a chance. On the outskirts of Cambridge, Massachusetts, stands an unremarkable building marked simply as Number 20, long, grey, with creaky floors and the scent of machine oil. No one knew then that within these modest walls, a new era of warfare was about to begin. In the summer of 1941, a sign appeared on the door, Radiation Laboratory, MIT. Inside were hundreds of young people in white lab coats, engineers, mathematicians, physicists. Most had never held a weapon, yet they were tasked with creating one that could see everything. The lab operated without pomp, but with fanatic intensity. There were no military drills, but there was a cult of speed. Every new experiment had to yield results within 3 days or never. Shifts lasted 16 hours. Beds were set up in the basement for those who practically lived among wires and oscilloscopes. Among them were rising stars like Luis Alvarez, future Nobel laureate, and John Slater, architect of the first radar systems for fighter planes. At the center of their focus was the magnetron. The British mistake had become an object of reverence. The Americans reinforced its design, increased its power, stabilized its frequency. Within 3 months, the first prototype of a centimeter-wave radar came to life on the test bench. It could detect a metal target the size of a boat at over 10 kilometers. No one had ever seen anything like it. MIT physicists described the moment with awe. On the screen of an old oscilloscope, a tiny green dot flickered for the first time, a signal from a plane flying over Boston. The lab erupted in applause. "We caught it," said Alvarez. "We see the invisible." Weeks later, the project reached a new level. The US government officially designated Rad Lab as a priority program. Funding poured in. From every lab, university and factory, trains and trucks delivered copper, quartz, coils, and glass tubes. American industry roared like a volcano, all to make a clear line appear on a radar screen. Each breakthrough was born from late-night debates. People didn't argue politics. They argued about wavelength, reflection coefficients, anode thickness. In the hum of fans, the crackle of discharges, and the smell of ozone, solutions emerged that would later save thousands of lives. In one engineer's diary, a line was preserved. "We don't feel the war, but we know that every line of the formula is someone's life saved in the Atlantic." Soon, the experiments left the lab. The first prototype radars were installed on planes and ships. Military observers watched the tests in astonishment. Submarines, once invisible beneath the waves, now appeared on screens as glowing dots. Patrol aircraft could find them even in storms. Escort ships learned to hear the enemy before torpedoes were launched. In the summer of 1942, British convoys in the Atlantic felt the change. Where once wolf packs of German submarines surfaced without warning, now there was silence. One Navy commander wrote in his report, "They vanished as suddenly as they appeared. We see farther than death." Work never stopped. Each day brought improvements. Bulky setups gave way to compact versions fit for aircraft. Complex control panels became simple indicators any pilot could use. MIT engineers joked, "We're building the future out of copper pipes and coffee." By the end of 1943, centimeter-wave radar was no longer experimental. It had become the backbone of Allied military superiority. American Liberators, British Lancasters, destroyers and submarines all now had eyes that could see through fog, night and storm. The irony is that it all began with a mistake, a miscalculated frequency. One accidental glitch in a Birmingham lab gave birth to an entire universe of technology. RadLab became more than a laboratory. It became a factory of insight, where war turned into mathematics and mathematics into salvation, and where people who never held a weapon defeated darkness each night with the light of a green screen. Spring 1943. The Atlantic roars, churns, and swallows ships. Convoys stretching from Canada to Britain are like living veins of war. Through them flow fuel, food, weapons, hope. And all of it is in the crosshairs of Admiral Dönitz's submarines, the wolf packs, operating with ruthless precision. Every time it's the same: night, fog, the howl of storm winds, and suddenly a torpedo trail, an explosion, cries over the radio. In 1 week of March, the Allies lose over 500,000 tons of cargo. London trembles. Washington demands answers. And then enters the miracle born at MIT and perfected by the British, the centimeter-wave radar powered by the magnetron. The first test took place aboard a Wellington aircraft. Pilots had nicknamed it the Blind Hunter. It usually patrolled at night, almost at random. But now, a glowing green circle lit up its instrument panel, the radar screen. On it, sky and sea, drawn in flashes. Each dot a reflected signal. At first, the pilots didn't believe it. But when a small blip appeared on the screen, and beneath them, from foam and darkness, the black body of a submarine surfaced, everything became clear. "We caught it without seeing the sea or the stars," wrote RAF pilot Thomas Hampton in his journal. "It's as if the ocean itself began to speak." Soon, such radars were installed on all patrol aircraft and destroyers. The wolf packs were no longer invisible. By morning over the Bay of Biscay, the first reports came in. 3 submarines destroyed overnight. By summer, hundreds. U-boat commanders felt fear for the first time. Their greatest strength, stealth, had vanished. Dönitz, in despair, demanded new means of concealment. But the magnetron left no room for escape. It could see through rain, through storms, across dozens of kilometers. Witnesses described how the atmosphere in the Atlantic changed. Where once there was hopelessness, now stood focused confidence. Aboard ships, in the control rooms, captains stood before screens like priests at altars. Greenish lines, tiny flashes. This became the new language of war. We no longer guess where the enemy is. We simply look. In Allied reports from May 1943, a strange phrase appears. The Battle of the Atlantic was won through vision. That vision cost hundreds of sleepless nights, millions of dollars, and one accidental error in a British lab. The paradox: the Allies hadn't created a new weapon of destruction. They had created a weapon of knowledge. They didn't amplify devastation. They illuminated the darkness. But there was another side. Every radar success meant the death of hundreds of German sailors, young, frightened, sealed in steel coffins. Pilots returning from patrols wrote in their logs, "The dot disappeared from the screen." Then a stain on the water, and silence. Sometimes I feel like we drowned ghosts. The war against an invisible enemy became a war against one's own conscience. And yet, this technology turned the tide at sea. After May 1943, convoy losses dropped fivefold. American and British forces were able to transport millions of tons of supplies across the ocean, supplies that would later fuel the Normandy landings. Without radar, without the magnetron, without those nightly flashes on the screens, Dönitz might have starved Britain into surrender. But instead, his fleet vanished into the very darkness from which it came. Radar became the eyes of the Allies. Ironically, it all began with a simple glitch in a formula, and two engineers who dared to look into the noise of electromagnetic emptiness. We learned to see the enemy, but perhaps more importantly, we learned to see ourselves, wrote Dr. Alvarez in 1945, one of the creators of American radar. 1943. The sea no longer belongs to the wolf packs, but the sky remains a battlefield of signals. Every radio wave is now a projectile, every transmission a risk. The deeper the war progressed, the clearer it became. Victory would go not to the side with the most guns, but to the one that knew when to listen, and when to remain silent. At first glance, radio communication seems like an invisible weapon. No explosions, no heroic charges, just dry crackles, Morse code beeps, voices in headphones. Yet this unseen front decided the fate of entire operations. In London, in a basement beneath Baker Street, worked the people the Allies called ghost ears, radio intelligence operators. They sat for hours at receivers, intercepting German transmissions, memorizing call signs, frequencies, rhythms. And if anyone thought radio waves flew freely like birds, they were mistaken. By 1943, the air over Europe was thick as soup, saturated with signals, ciphers, fake broadcasts, and deceptive coordinates. The British knew. German submarines coordinated via radio. Dönitz had built a whole system of silent networks, where each U-boat knew only its nearest neighbors. Yet every transmission left a trace. Faint, but real. That's when the idea of radio deception was born. At Bovington Air Base, a group of officers and engineers gathered. Their mission sounded like something out of a spy novel. We must convince the Germans we are somewhere we're not. Using several transmitters synchronized with patrol aircraft, the British began creating phantom squadrons, illusory groups that broadcast signals as if dozens of planes were heading toward a single target. The Germans took it seriously, scrambling fighters, burning fuel, wasting time and nerves. One of the masters of this new invisible war was Lieutenant Douglas Reed, a young radio engineer from Manchester. His hands trembled not from fear, but from caffeine. He could go 2 days without sleep, tuning waves, adjusting phases. In his diary, he wrote, "Sometimes I feel like a conductor of an orchestra that plays silence. Our instruments are emptiness and deception." Reed developed a frequency shift system, allowing transmissions to change frequency every few seconds. To the enemy, it looked like dozens of different transmitters. To the Allies, a single voice. It was a cipher, a symphony of chaos. One night, Reed and his team launched a series of fake signals off the coast of France. On German radar screens, phantom convoys lit up. The Kiel command sounded the alarm. 30 submarines moved to intercept, but there wasn't a single real ship in the sea. Only silence. And while German crews searched for ghosts, the real transports sailed safely along the northern route, untouched. Thus, radio became a new battlefield. One fought not with bayonets, but with impulses, not with bodies, but with frequencies. Those who worked with signals joked, "In this war, even the air lies." But beneath the jokes lay exhaustion. Radio operators lived between noise and silence, where a 1-second mistake could cost hundreds of lives. Their eyes ached from dim lamplight. Their ears rang even in sleep. Yet it was their work that allowed the Allies to deceive not only the German fleets, but also the Abwehr's intelligence network during preparations for the Normandy landings. Every false wave, every ghostly signal was part of a vast symphony of deception, known as Operation Bodyguard. Thanks to these faceless voices, German command became convinced the invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. Radio won the battle before it even began. After the war, Douglas Reed wrote in his memoirs, "I saw how silence can be a weapon. Sometimes victory comes not from a shot, but from a perfectly timed pause." And perhaps that is the central paradox of World War II. The most destructive conflicts of the 20th century were won not only by tanks and guns, but by people who learned to deceive sound. Summer 1944. Normandy already reeked of gunpowder, but the real battle wasn't on the beaches. It was fought in forests, fields, and quiet French villages, where among apple orchards hid people who officially didn't exist. They were called liaison agents, resistance couriers, shadows of intelligence. But in the headquarters of London and High Command, they had another name: S-phone operators. The S-phone was a small device, no larger than a briefcase, with 2 units, one in the hands of an agent on the ground, the other with a pilot in the sky. Between them stretched an invisible thread of radio waves, narrow, focused like a spotlight beam. Only the 2 of them could hear each other. It wasn't just a communication tool, it was a lifeline between life and death. The system worked like a miracle. The agent on the ground would set up the antenna, aim it at the sky, and activate the transmitter. A plane flying at 1,500–2,000 meters would catch the beam and respond. The range was only a few kilometers, but that was enough. On German radar screens, these conversations didn't exist. No signals, no coordinates, only silence. One of those who used the S-phone was British agent Violette Szabo, a woman whose name became legend, though she herself would never have said so. She was 23, had a child, and the war had taken her husband. She accepted the mission knowing full well the odds of returning were slim. On the night of June 6, 1944, one day before the Allied landings, she parachuted into the Loire Valley. In her hands, a pistol and an S-phone unit. Violette hid the antenna in the bushes and switched on the power. The lamp lit up. The signal was live. "Falcon, this is Juliet. Do you read me?" She spoke into the microphone. The reply came almost instantly. "Juliet, we have you. Coordinates received. Hold position." In that moment, sky and earth were joined. Above, a Halifax pilot carrying containers of weapons and supplies for the partisans. Below, a young woman risking everything alone to ensure the drop succeeded. The operation lasted 14 minutes. Then the signal vanished. The Germans began scanning the airwaves, but found nothing. The narrow S-phone beam didn't scatter, didn't reflect. It spoke a language nature itself couldn't hear. The technology was so advanced that in some cases, agents used it to guide aircraft to improvised airstrips in fields, with a single lamp covered by cloth and a voice in the pilot's headset. The S-phone allowed for course corrections, speed adjustments, altitude changes, all without a single public radio signal. But behind this cold description of technology stood human nerves, trembling hands, and hearts beating so loudly it seemed a patrol might hear them. Every time an agent activated the S-phone, they risked being discovered. Not by signal, but by the glow of a lamp, the sound of footsteps, the rhythm of breath. One SOE, Special Operations Executive Report, contains a brief note. Radio operator Noel, captured in Brittany, transmitted Allied aircraft coordinates 3 hours before arrest. Her message saved 27 lives. Noel was Jacqueline Leroy. Her S-phone transmitter was later found shattered, antenna snapped in two, casing riddled with bullets. The device was destroyed, but her work survived. The S-phone became a symbol of a new era in intelligence. An era where sound was a weapon and silence a shield. Those who used the device rarely lived to tell the tale, but their voices remain in archives, fragments of radio tapes, snippets of transmissions, and in each one you can almost physically hear the tremble. It was these people, nameless and forgotten, who ensured the precision of the landings, saved hundreds of downed pilots behind enemy lines, and proved that sometimes the fate of war hangs not on a tank or a plane, but on a tiny button marked Transmit. By the summer of 1944, the S-phone was no longer just a piece of technology. It had become a weapon of trust. When Allied aircraft flew over Europe at night, pilots heard more than the drone of engines. They heard quiet voices from the darkness. 5 degrees left, just a little more. Drop. These words were worth more than any command. Behind them lay miles of forest, German patrols, and agents hiding beneath the moonlight. But with each passing day, the risk grew. The Wehrmacht began to suspect that someone was guiding Allied planes, that supply drops were landing directly into the hands of the resistance, as if someone were drawing a map right under the Gestapo's nose. The Germans deployed entire networks of radio direction finders, their trucks with rotating antennas roaming France, trying to catch even the faintest impulse. Yet the S-phone remained a ghost. Its secret lay in the unique directionality of its signal. Unlike standard radios that broadcast in all directions, the S-phone emitted a narrow beam aimed strictly upward, like a flashlight pointed at a single patch of sky. That meant it was nearly impossible to intercept, unless you were directly between the agent and the aircraft. Moreover, engineers at Britain's combined research establishment devised a clever trick. The transmitter's frequency changed every time the device was activated, not by a fixed algorithm, but through random fluctuations of a quartz oscillator. This made signal interception impossible. By the time German technicians managed to tune in, the conversation was already over. But the Allies knew, in war, silence is an unreliable ally. So in case the S-phone was ever detected, they created a system of false voices. Hidden radio stations in London and at bases in Bristol duplicated the airwaves, generating fake conversations at random locations. German radar operators picked up these phantom signals and sent teams hunting into nothing. Agents on the ground called it the fog curtain. "When the air rings with voices, but all of them are ghosts," wrote one resistance radio operator in his diary. Meanwhile, pilots themselves called the S-phone a miracle not to be trusted. They knew one wrong signal, one stray impulse, and a German Nachtjäger, night fighter, would be in the sky. So all transmissions were brief, almost encrypted. No names, no places, just numbers, codes, and a voice as restrained as breath before a jump. One RAF report preserved a line that would later be quoted in countless films and memoirs. "We heard only a voice, didn't know who she was, where she was, but her coordinates saved the entire crew. Later we learned she was captured a week later." The war for the airwaves was silent, without guns or front lines. It was a battle for silence, for that invisible frequency where every whisper could change the course of an operation. When the Allies liberated Paris in September 1944, the first communications teams arrived in the ruined city, carrying everything that had made them invisible: radios, encryptors, and among them, small black S-phone boxes. One engineer wrote in his report, "We found our devices in the hands of French agents. Almost all were damaged, but not one had been surrendered to the enemy. They burned with their operators." The S-phone ended the war as it had lived, in the shadows. It wasn't written about in newspapers, never shown in parades, but without it, hundreds of SOE and OSS missions would have ended in disaster. Today, in the Bletchley Park Museum, one surviving S-phone sits in a display case without a label. Just a black box, unmarked. But if you listen closely to history, it seems you can still hear that voice slipping into the fog. "Falcon, this is Juliet. Do you read me?" If the history of World War II could speak, its voice would likely be female. Not loud, not heroic, but quiet, focused, like those who sat in half-darkness before a radio set, listening to the endless hiss of the ether and tapping out Morse code under the threat of death. Among those who used the S-phone, more than a third were women. And they became the heart of this invisible war. They were known by other names: faceless girls, shadows on the frequency, operators of the night. No one knew their real names. Even the pilots they spoke to knew only their call signs: Juliet, Echo, Violet, Starling. Their task was simple and impossible at once: to make contact with an aircraft, guide it precisely to the drop point, transmit a brief signal, and vanish. Time allowed: no more than 3 minutes. Each activation of the S-phone was like a breath underwater. Everything had to be done before the enemy could hear you breathe. One of these radio operators, Noor Inayat Khan, daughter of an Indian Sufi and an English musician, was later called the bravest voice in Europe. Her hands trembled not from fear, but from cold, in the attic of a Paris house where she hid her antenna beneath the roof. When London asked, "Are you ready?" she simply replied, "Always ready." The S-phone allowed her to communicate with aircraft flying from England to drop parachutists or containers of weapons. Her voice echoed in the sky, alone across hundreds of kilometers. East 40 degrees, clear, drop. Pilots later said it felt like speaking to a ghost. The connection would flicker, but her voice held no panic, no hesitation, only cold precision. And that was what saved lives. but every transmission was a step along a razor's edge. The Germans knew a radio operator was active in Paris, and they couldn't catch her. Their radar systems detected strange impulses, but the signal vanished too quickly. All because of one engineering detail. The S-phone's narrow beam made it impossible to trace the source. Still, the hunt continued. Archived reports contain notes like, "Signal detected near Montparnasse. Transmission under 120 seconds. Direction undetermined." These lines are the footprints left by a woman who spoke to the sky. Noor kept transmitting even after her entire network was dismantled. She was warned, "Leave, the channel is dead." But she replied, "Without communication, there is no hope." And she stayed. The S-phone became her final weapon. Through it, she relayed data on German troop movements, and thanks to her coordinates, in August 1943, the British executed a precision strike on a railway line supplying the Wehrmacht. It delayed troop reinforcements by 2 weeks, an eternity in wartime. Later, when Noor was captured, the Germans tried to understand how she had managed to transmit without being detected. They didn't realize it wasn't just about technology. It was about how she listened to silence. Radio operators called it feeling the ether. She knew when a wave was clean and when danger was hiding within it. After the war, one of the engineers who helped build the S-phone said in an interview, "We built a device that could speak to the sky, but it was they, the women of the ether, who taught it to whisper." Today, their names are rarely found in textbooks, but every time Allied pilots returned home alive, someone on the ground switched off the S-phone, erased the traces, and smiled, knowing another mission had ended without loss. This story isn't about technology. It's about the people who became its voice, those who spoke in whispers, and whose echoes sounded like victory.